final panel. And I'm very pleased to introduce, and I'll go one by one again. I'm very pleased to introduce George Filatov, who's a research fellow at the Institute of World History at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's a graduate of the Moscow State University of Lomonosov. He has a master's degree in the theory of international relations from Manchester, and he studies the history of Spain in the 20th century, and he pays particular attention to the history of regional and state nationalism.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank all the organizers who choose my small communication for this wonderful event, and for all the work that they made, especially Albert, who suffered a lot from many of my letters. So thank you, and thanks to all who made this possible. So I'll speak a little bit about the consequences of the First World War and the Versailles Conference on Spain, which is not really very well started. Well, as we know, the First World War had great consequences and great impact on the emergence of the national movements all over the world. We had a lot of presentations about this when we spoke about Vietnam, about China, Middle East, and other parts. Well, definitely all these national movements, they started to emerge before, and the Catalan is among these examples. It started to emerge in the second half of the 19th century, but only the end of the Great European War led to the rise of the first Catalan separatist organizations. At the time of the Paris Peace Conference, the most important symbols of the Catalan separatism appeared, one of which is the most obvious one, which is the flag. So, how did it happen? Well, during the second half of the 19th century, Catalonia experienced the emergence of nationalism, and this process was part of the broad pattern in Europe, which had started earlier in the first half of the 19th century and related to the emergence of the Napoleonic Wars and all the consequences of the wars for independence in different parts of the world against the French invasion in Spain, for example, also. Well, concepts of nation-states appeared, and in Catalonia, everything started with the cultural revival, and by the end of the 19th century, first Catalanist organizations, parties appeared, and they started to play an important role not only in Catalonia, but also in the on the Spanish level. However, separatism at that moment was not part of their ideology. The idea of gaining full independence was not widespread among the intellectuals in Catalonia at that moment, before the start of the Great War. Even at the time of the collapse of the Spanish monarchy and the First Spanish Republic, when a small group of Catalan nationalists tried to do something, they proclaimed a Catalan state inside a federal Spain, which they hoped would be, so they didn't claim independence. So there were some people who thought about independent Catalonia, but they were totally marginalized. They didn't even create any kind of big works, systematic thought on this issue. So what happened during the First World War with Catalonia? Well, first of all, as we all know, the collapse of foreign empires, and the appearance of the new nations on their territories resulted in a nationalistic wave all over the world. But in most cases, this wave took territories and people who participated in the war by this or that means. So in India, which was part of the British Empire, in Vietnam, which was part of the French Empire, and other parts in Europe, which will also take part in the war. However, the case of Spain was different. Spain did not take part in the First World War. It was neutral, although the king wanted to go to fight to war, but all the generals said, well, we don't have any forces to do that. So why this pattern also included Catalonia, well, Spain, and in my case, Catalonia? Well, in total, Spain was neutral. Inside it, there was a small civil war of wards. Some part of Spanish society supported Entente, and other part supported central empires, central powers. In Catalonia, the debates got a specific stance. During the Great War, all parties, warring parties, in some moment adopted some version of support of small nationalities. Both parties, both Entente and Central Powers, they supported self-determination of certain groups inside the enemy's camp. Although this recognition of the right of people for self-determination served in great part for the propagandistically tactical aims, these claims had consequences, and not only in the states that were engaged in the war. Nationalistic movements in some parts of the world got a new ideological ground created by the propagandists and the ideologists of these warring powers, which they used for their own purpose, but in other parts of the world, which were not part of the war, this creates a new language for them. And Catalonia is one of these cases. The idea of self-determination from the First World War, was legitimized by the great powers. The external stimulus helped some parts of the nationalistic movement of Catalonia to direct their claims towards the idea of independent state. Catalans predominantly supported the Allies' cause. They had, because the Allies had an image of the liberals fighting for the democracy, for the rights of the small nations, especially in the second part of the Great War. And this was especially true with the Catalan Republicans, which were as a minority, because they stated themselves against the Castilian or Spanish monarchists, who were predominantly pro-German, because of the connections between the Spanish court and the Habsburg court. And also, Spanish monarchists, they advocated, as well, it's obvious, national unity. At the same time, Catalans adopted the idea that to be truly a nation, to be independent, well, to be a true nation should have a foreign policy, some kind of foreign policy. So while in general Spain was trying to maintain neutral, not to support neither of the parts, Catalans, from time to time, the organization sent greetings to allied generals when they had victories. For example, they sent a greeting to the Joffre after the first Battle of Marne and called him victorious Northern Catalan, because he was from Roussillon, which is a Catalan part in France. Nevertheless, what is very interesting, some part of Catalan nationalists sympathized the Central Powers. And this is case of Prat de la Riba, one of the founders of Catalan nationalism, but it's mainly true before the First World War. He denounced French Republican centralism, because France at that moment was a unitary country with strong centralization, and he praised at the same time Austro-Hungarian movement. And he considered that as a possibility, as an option for the new Catalonia, for the Spain, where Catalonia can get some kind of autonomy. And Austro-Hungary could have been an example for him. Nevertheless, well, most part of the Catalans, they were neutral, because those who gave money to the nationalist movement were Catalan businessmen, industrial people, and they tried to gain money having business with all parts. Nevertheless, because as all parts supported this or that way the claims of some small nations, Catalanists thought that no matter who would win this war, it would change Europe, and the new international order would recognize small nations, this or that. This was a general thought by them. One of the other reasons why many small nations in Europe especially claimed rights for creation of their independence, but it's also true for the African states of African colonies, Asian colonies, was that they defended the cause of one of the parts. People from this area took part in the war. For example, for the Catalans, the biggest example was the Czech Legion, which was created on the territory of the Russian Empire at the beginning. The Catalans tried to use this stance, and in 1915 there was created a journal Iberia, which was in favor of Entente cause. But the most important that this journal started to create a myth about Catalan volunteers who fought for the Allied cause in the trenches or the Great War. The journal launched a campaign to support them, and they were presented as a unit which was defending the cause, and that's why Catalonia in the future maybe will have to receive something. However, the reality was very, very modest, because there were less than 1,000 Catalans fighting in French army, both the French army and the Foreign Legion. Most of them were the Catalans who settled in France before 1914 and were just hoping to get French citizenship. Those, among these 1,000 Catalans, who supported the Catalanist cause and maintained contacts with the nationalist political forces, were minority, not more than 30 persons. So most of these volunteers, who were described as brave Catalans fighting for the Catalan cause in this journal, would have been very surprised if they had found out that they are fighting for the autonomous or independent Catalan, as this journal tried to present. The end of the 1917th and the beginning of the 1918 was a time when Catalanists, as many other national movements, received a very serious impulse because of the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin's thesis about self-determination, but first of all because of the Wilson's 14 points, which advocated a vague idea of self-determination of people and nationalities. First of all, these 14 points gave us some kind of moral excuse for the Entente cause. But, as we discussed also, it was interpreted by many radicals as they wanted to see these points. And the Catalan radicals interpreted it as a possibility, as a permission for the right for independence for the Catalonia. So they wanted to see it, and they saw it. In summer of the 1918, a pro-Catalonia committee was founded, and it was trying to internationalize Catalan problem. This organization tried to mobilize the need of Catalan volunteers, using the example of the Czech Legion fighting for the Entente cause. They got an opportunity to internationalize this cause exactly when the war ended, with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Ottoman Empire. In different Catalan cities, banquets in honor of Wilson were organized, and they were using what they referenced during these speeches to the Wilsonian 14 points, saying that we have to try to take our liberty, to take our autonomy, referencing to the Wilson, not speaking exactly about his 14 points, but referencing that. At first, Catalans tried it also to pressure on Madrid. They tried to make Madrid to send Catalan representatives to the Versailles and then to the League of Nations. One of the journals said that, the sacrifice of the Catalan volunteers should be paid by the Allies, which was definitely a myth, but they used it. Nevertheless, all the Catalans' separatist desires could not stand tough reality, because nobody was preoccupied with Spain and Catalonia at the end of the war. But the very interesting moment that there were a lot of Catalan organizations and groups that tried to do that. They were different. They were radicals, leftists, more on the right, but they had some common elements, some common strategy. Well, I will say about radical and moderate Catalanists. So, moderate Catalanists tried just to use the end of the First World War to gain autonomy for the region, and that's all. While the radicals tried to try to gain some kind of independence, to create an independent country for the Catalan people. So both of them tried to use the Versailles Conference. The radicals understood that, well, creating an independent state is something there was a very small possibility, but they tried to at least receive some kind of acknowledgement from the part of the winning part of the Entente. So, different groups. First of all, the veterans. A small group of veterans created Catalan National Committee, which is just the same thing as the Czech National Committee, which was created in 1915 and then transformed in the provisional government for the Czechoslovakia. This committee sent several leaflets to the members of the delegation, and they first used the flag of Catalonia, the Estelada, which if you see the contemporary manifestations of the Catalan separatists, well, they are still using it. This is the first appearance of this flag. Another moment is that Catalan immigrants that were settled in different Latin American countries, precisely on Cuba and Argentina, they also sent several letters to Wilson without any response, claiming independence for their cause, for their independence cause. Well, frankly, there wasn't any kind of answer from European countries, from those who were in Versailles, but the Spanish government was a little bit preoccupied. So the Prime Minister of Spain went to Paris in the beginning, in the middle of the December of 1918, when the preparation for the conference took place. So he met with Clemenceau, then with Wilson, and they both assured that nobody was against Spanish monarchy, and no one would like to disintegrate Spain. So, well, this was the case. So, moderate Catalanists tried to use the inside Spanish politics. They tried to get autonomy for their region, and they even proposed a bill for the Corteses to create the first autonomous statute for Catalonia, but it failed. Nobody said, well, King closed the parliament, the Corteses. The excuse was the social conflict in Barcelona, so it failed. The vote on this statute should have been on the 27th of January. This day, the parliament was closed for these reasons, and this led to the radicalization of the Catalanist movement, because on the 2nd of February, the Democratic National Federation was founded, and the first aim was the self-determination of Catalonia, which was written in its first manifesto. The most important thing that these people in this confederation, they used the language introduced by the Entente during the war, and especially during the peace conference. The words like self-determination, creation of national state, independence, etc. became the part of the language. So just to conclude, because I don't have a lot of time, The most important thing which brought to the Catalans is not just the causes, the examples of the appearance of the new states, because well, in the past it also happened sometimes. The case is that the new language appeared for them, which they started to use, and which became a very important part for the Catalanist movement, because this party, Democratic Nationalist Federation, would soon transform in the Esquerra Republicana, which in 1930s became the leading party in Catalonia, and which is now the leading party, separatist party in Catalonia. And the Paris Peace Conference not only created, but legitimized the language, because now the nation states, creation of nation state, associated with the modernity. Before that, the Catalanist nationalists, they thought, well, that modernity, what they saw before that, they saw that the most modern states, these are national empires, Britain, France, and well, and they thought about Catalan that it should be part of the Spanish Empire, but maybe the capital should be moved from Madrid to Barcelona. But they didn't thought about Catalonia as an independent state. Now this was legitimized, and just well to say the last word, this language. This is one of the most important things that for the Catalans, that Catalans got from the end of the First World War, from the Versailles conferences, and this is one of the things that, in my opinion, we didn't talk a lot about the creation of the new languages, which helps to create new ideas and the new aims for the people. Although the results for the Catalonia was very modest, definitely. Thank you very much.
So next is Christy Thornton, who is an assistant professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Johns Hopkins University. She received her PhD in history in 2015 from New York University, and she's completing her first book, Revolution in Development, Mexico and the Governance of the Global Economy, which is under contract from the University of California Press.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know if this, this microphone, I'm afraid, is a little androgenic, so I don't know that my outfit is exactly the right thing for this. But so thanks very much to all of you who have thanks of course to the organizers, and thanks to all of you who've stuck it out here all the way through Sunday. I'm very grateful to see this many people in the room. I had expected that everyone would have chosen an Aperol Spritz over a paper about Mexico by this point in the conference, so thank you for being here. Being here as the last paper on the last panel is perhaps somehow appropriate, as Mexico might be the last place you think about when you think about the end of World War I and the founding of the League of Nations. After all, Mexico doesn't join the League of Nations until 1931, after this kind of long and protracted battle where they insist on receiving an invitation to join the League of Nations. No other country ever needed an invitation. They go through this long protracted battle. And in fact, Mexico makes a kind of international incident of their not joining the League of Nations during the Paris Peace Conference itself. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about Mexico, but also about the United States' perception of Mexico and the kind of central importance that plays in why the United States ultimately declines to join this institution that Wilson has fought for so long. As this weekend has maybe indicated, and this conference is not alone in this, this is of the kind of broader trend within attempts within history to be more global, right? Latin America is frequently considered a kind of world apart from the rest of what would become the global South. It's separated from discussions about mandates and empires by the century of formal independence that most of the region had achieved by the time we get to 1919. And this division gets reinforced in all of these sorts of global history conferences where we draw these kind of geographical boundaries around panels and then try to tease out thematic connections as we do this. And so I've been really grateful to see those thematic connections come out in the kind of Q&A, and I think we should be having more of those kinds of conversations. So this tendency to divide ourselves up into an area studies model, which serves us very well in many areas, I think has actually led us, as I argued in a recent journal article, to create in the historical literature what I've been calling a kind of decolonization divide. That is, we have on the one side a kind of understanding of global history in the countries that decolonized during the 20th century, and as completely separate from the formally sovereign but economically and politically weak countries of Latin America. So one of the contentions in the sort of hobby horse of mine that I've been taking around the world is that if we consider the long-standing and multifaceted struggles over what we might call economic sovereignty, that is, something more complicated than a kind of merely inward-looking economic nationalism, but instead the struggle to define and create an international regime in which autonomous decisions about economic policy is even possible, then we would begin to cross this decolonization divide and tell a kind of richer and fuller story about what brings together the sort of full weight of the global South, that is, the countries in the decolonizing nations of Asia and Africa, together with those that had long had independence in Latin America. So in that spirit, I want to raise a provocation here in my paper today. And that provocation is this question: what if, in a way that we do not remember at all, either in the historical literature, the sort of prevailing historiography, in the way that we teach school children about why the United States doesn't join the League of Nations, what if the fight within the United States over whether or not to join the League was in fact not about sort of entanglements in Europe, but was largely about freedom of action in Mexico? That is, so we tend to remember in this common knowledge, right, US public's reluctance to get involved in European affairs, the kind of reaction to the war, etc. But in reading the actual documentation of the debate, sort of within Congress, in the press, in broader public opinion, right, you find over and over again a much greater worry within the United States that in fact the problem with the League of Nations was that it would constrain US freedom of action in Latin America, and particularly in Mexico, and therefore would actually threaten what many understood as the main source of US power to that point in world history. So, of course, the thing that makes this possible, the thing that even makes my provocation possible, is that there is this historical coincidence between the end of World War I, the Paris Peace Conference, and the end of what we consider the kind of military phase of the Mexican Revolution. And so by 1919, in Mexico, the kind of more conservative constitutionalist faction of what we call the broader revolutionary family had roundly defeated competing factions of peasant and worker-led competitors for state power, and the primer jefe, the kind of first chief, General Venustiano Carranza, had sort of overseen a kind of raucous and contentious writing of Mexico's new revolutionary constitution of 1917. And this Mexican Revolutionary Constitution of 1917 really becomes the first social democratic charter in world history. So because of the concerted efforts of many more radical revolutionary factions within the Mexican Revolution, the 1917 Constitution is in fact more radical than even Carranza wants it to be. It guarantees education, it guarantees workers' rights, and crucially, it radically redefines property rights. And that is the linchpin on which this entire question turns. Article 27 of the new Constitution declares private property is a privilege created by the nation, and therefore argues that this privilege would be constrained by what it calls the public interest and managed by the state, quote, to ensure a more equitable distribution of public wealth. So rather than private property being inalienably vested in the individual, as a kind of traditional liberal understanding has it, in Mexico after 1917, the Constitution states that private property is vested in the nation and therefore adjudicated by the state for the common well-being. This redefinition, I'm going to argue here, animates this massive debate within the United States about what the League might represent with regard to what's called the Mexico question, that is the question of the new Mexican property rights regime. Would joining the League of Nations bind the United States from taking action against any prospective confiscatory actions of their revolutionary neighbor to the south? Would the League somehow sanction this new property doctrine, as it was called, and give it cover under international law and international norms? These questions actually become crucial topics for a broad set of actors who arrive in Paris in late 1918, early 1919, from Mexico, from the US, and from elsewhere in Europe. And especially during the first few months in the conference, that is from the beginning of January through Wilson's return to Paris when he comes back from the United States in March. So we have representatives of the Mexican revolutionary state, we have anti-revolutionary Mexican exiles living in Europe, we have representatives of the Catholic Church also coming from the United States, crucially private US and European oil and banking interests, and US and European government representatives, all in Paris fighting over the question of how the international community should understand the new Mexican Constitution and its redefinition of property rights. And therefore, having this large debate about Mexico's position vis-a-vis this emerging world order. So in the larger piece from which this small talk is drawn, I delve into great detail on each of these interests and the contests that played out in Paris, in Washington, in Mexico City over them. And I do this as a historian of Mexico from the Mexican perspective, looking kind of outside in on the Wilsonian project, as we have all done since the publication of Manella's book, no? But today, I want to stress rather the centrality of Mexico for the US actors in the lead debate. So this is kind of a small piece of this. And that is because if you even cursorily read all of this documentation about the debate over the League of Nations in the United States, Mexico just comes up over and over and over and over. As has been noted here in this conference a few times, much of this debate turns on the rubric of the Monroe Doctrine, right? And the US rights and privileges in Latin America that are embodied within it. In fact, one League supporter calls the question of the Monroe Doctrine the greatest bugbear of the League debate. And the historical record actually bears this out. But the question of the Monroe Doctrine is actually, it is this kind of broader question about the US role in Latin America, but it's also centrally a question over whether the new multilateral commitments might override the rights and privileges that the US claims, which in the eyes of the defenders of the Monroe Doctrine guarantee a kind of right of US intervention to protect US interests in the region. So the Mexicans, of course, who are involved in these negotiations know that this question is so central in the United States. They're following the debates incredibly closely. Everything that's going on in Washington, everything that's going on in Paris is being reported in the Mexico City newspapers, is being cabled about between these three cities. And there are long debates within Mexico about whether Mexico should try to join the League of Nations as a neutral nation, sort of what stance it would take vis-a-vis the League. And in the Mexican Congress, there are these sorts of long debates back and forth about this. But so in late 1918, President Carranza sends an envoy, Alberto J. Pani, to Paris with the charge of acting as a, quote, suitable observer for the negotiations for the elaboration of a peace treaty. So there isn't very much in that mandate. He's just there to be an observer. But indicative of the concern over the presence of this representative of the Mexican revolutionary state is the New York Times article about it, which is the reason that I found out about this in the first place, because this one New York Times article is cited in the secondary literature everywhere and is sort of the source of what people think about Mexico's role in this. And so this piece reports that Alberto Pani is going to, quote, endeavor to have the ideas of the new Mexican Constitution incorporated as a principle of international law, unquote, when he gets to Paris. And that Pani is going to seek official representation as a representative of the new Mexican revolutionary government at the conference itself. So Pani arrives in Paris, and he is just immediately besieged by holders of Mexican debt that is in default both in Europe and the United States. And so everywhere he goes, he's basically followed on the street by holders of Mexican bonds, angry that these bonds have not been paid since the outbreak of the revolution in 1910, right? So people who had bought debt in Mexican railroad concessions, all of these kinds of broader financial instruments that people throughout Europe and the United States are holding, they're incredibly angry that the revolution has interrupted and made it so that this debt isn't being paid. And Pani himself professes a kind of befuddlement that he's in France and that the French, he calls them the inventors of the rights of man, can't see the justice of Mexico's own revolution in the same lineage as the French Revolution. He uses this kind of liberal language to harken back to say, we've simply fulfilled kind of what the French Revolution calls for here. So at the same time, of course, many opponents of the Mexican Revolution and its new constitution also send their envoys to Paris to attempt to ensure that the Mexican government doesn't receive some sort of cover, some sort of sanction from the new international institution. The Catholic Church, for example, sends an envoy who hopes to enshrine religious freedom in the new League covenant as a bulwark against the Mexican Revolution's anti-clericalism. So this actually falls apart largely because of the question about the introduction of the Japanese question on racial equality. There is a sense within the US and British delegations that if they recognize religious freedom, that they're going to have to also recognize this question of racial equality, and that they can't do those things. So they send Monsignor Kelly packing back to Chicago. Perhaps even more importantly than the kind of Catholic Church who hates the Mexican Revolution's anti-clerical nature are representatives of private capital in the United States and Great Britain. And so they get together and they begin to work out a strategy for how they're going to deal with Mexico in Paris. So just a few weeks after Pani arrives at Paris, the Executive Committee of the National Association for the Protection of American Rights in Mexico, which is an organization made up of the most powerful interests in mining, petroleum, banking, and these other business sectors, they meet at the headquarters of the Anaconda Copper Company, and they publicly announce their intentions to present their case against Mexico at the peace conference. They invite all these reporters and they have a press conference to say essentially that they are going to violate as private citizens US law about lobbying foreign governments, but that's neither here nor there. So the companies are seeking redress, particularly with regard to Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, this new private property doctrine, and they hope to make especially the oil question, right? Because all of these US and British companies control oil in Mexico, and they're really worried about what the new constitution is going to mean for their oil concessions. So they decide to send to Paris none other than Edward Doheny, who is the chairman of Mexican Petroleum. He is the most prominent US oil man in Mexico. His company controls 1.5 million acres of land in Mexico for these oil concessions. So the US capitalists tried to make the argument that the Mexico question was fundamental to the purpose of the Paris Peace Conference. And Doheny himself actually cites the more kind of universal implications. He's trying to make the case that he's not just talking about oil in Mexico, but about broader questions about international law and about what private property will look like in the new post-war world order. And so he posed the following rhetorical question to the press, and I'm going to read it at length because I think it's so illustrative of how these US private capital interests think in this moment. And this is again a place where we have these connections across regions that I think are very fruitful. So he says, "The question which has been raised by the Mexican government is one which will necessarily arise in each of the new score of more countries that will be formed in Eastern Europe. Will the people holding the reins in these new governments act as though they had descended by means of some great space navigating craft from Mars, the moon, or another celestial body, or an uninhabited planet, and proceed to appropriate for the government, which they may form, all of the land and other forms of property which exist? Or will they be compelled by the decent public opinion of mankind to conform to the well-established usages of all civilized nations when occupying conquered lands, and respect the rights in both person and property of the inhabitants thereof?" So the Mexican Revolutionary Constitution is as though some Martians have descended and never considered what the existing private property regime was. So in other words, when given control over new territories, would the governments of the newly formed states emerging out of this seek to control the use and distribution of property within that territory, or would they respect the rights of those with some prior claim to the land, to the subsoil resources, etc.? So this question of the relation of property to sovereignty is a crucial tension in the imaginary of the new post-war world, and one that continues to be debated, obviously, for decades through the long process of decolonization. So this is the question that underpins the debate that rages about the Monroe Doctrine and how US unilateral prerogative will be reconciled with new concerns about multilateral legitimacy. Wilson, of course, himself had famously decreed that the very idea of the idea that the League represented a global extension of the Monroe Doctrine, and he does this in his famous Peace Without Victory speech, where he says that the nations should, quote, adopt the doctrine of President Monroe as the doctrine of the world, with the result that, quote, no nation should seek to extend its polity over any other nation or people, but that every people should be left free to determine its own polity, its own way of development, unhindered, unthreatened, unafraid, the little along with the great and powerful. So this is Wilson sort of arguing that if we extend the Monroe Doctrine, that's what we get. And former President Taft, a leader in the League to Enforce Peace, as we've heard, agrees with this characterization. He argues in a speech before the National Geographic Society that the League proposal means that any violation of the Monroe Doctrine would, quote, require all great powers to unite in the maintenance of it. But here it's crucial to remember that Wilson's understanding of the Monroe Doctrine and his opponents, the Republicans in Congress and elsewhere, is quite different. And the US delegation actually throughout the course of the conference fights really hard against British and French and other insistence that there be some sort of actual legal definition of what the Monroe Doctrine means. The United States sort of makes it so that that is never actually written into the covenant despite carving out space for it. So Wilson's desire to extend the Monroe Doctrine didn't mean that he himself saw the doctrine as the sort of carte blanche over the hemisphere that many Republicans were actually implying. He made this clear. He actually convened a group of Mexican newspaper editors in 1918 and gives this long speech to them in which he cites the doctrine as, quote, one of the difficulties of our relationship with Latin America, and, end quote, and he pledges non-intervention from the self-appointed big brother in the region. So Wilson is making this kind of proto-good neighbor argument here. So this means that when Wilson returns from the Paris Peace Conference in February of 1919 to lobby at home for the League in the middle of the negotiations, his opponents are already suspicious of his actual adherence to the Monroe Doctrine, right? They think that when he says Monroe Doctrine, he means something very different than what they mean. And this is especially because of the unresolved nature of the Mexico problem. So the public conversation about the League and the place of the United States within it is almost always referenced. Mexico is almost always referenced, and the Western Hemisphere is almost always referenced, with the New York Times noting, quote, the Republicans base their opposition to the League largely on the argument that it overrides the Monroe Doctrine, right? So this becomes a kind of signal question when Wilson comes back to have this argument. So one of the loudest early voices in this debate was probably unsurprisingly former President Theodore Roosevelt, who uses his platform as an editorial writer to excoriate the League idea over and over again. So writing before the conference even begins, he says, quote, we ought not to permit any interference with the Monroe Doctrine, end quote, and he adds ominously, this is the title of my paper, quote, Mexico is our Balkan Peninsula, someday we will have to deal with it. And that's kind of left out there. What precisely dealing with it looks like is left for the reader to imagine. And League opponents to carry forward Roosevelt's message even after Theodore Roosevelt dies, and that very editorial is referenced in the famous debate between Senator Henry Cabot Lodge and Harvard President Abbott Lawrence Lowell about the League. So in that debate, Lodge argued that the Monroe Doctrine represents a kind of fence around the Western Hemisphere that precludes European intervention in American affairs, and the idea that Wilson's idea about sort of extending this, he finds ridiculous. He says, I've never been able to get it through my head how you could preserve a fence by taking it down. So the League, Lodge implies, would limit the United States' choice of actions with regard to Mexico, and the United States needs to now turn especially to the Mexico question now that the war in Europe is over. And so in nearly all of the public pronouncements by League opponents, the Monroe Doctrine is not simply a policy of the United States, right? It is actually constitutive of US power. And that's what you find when you read through these things. So Senator Miles Poindexter of Washington puts it really bluntly. He says, America is now a world power and must play its part in the affairs of the world. He says this in front of a crowd of hundreds of people. But rather than having this kind of entanglement of the United States and Europe, he says, that because it must play its parts in the affair of the world, he says, its part is the leadership and hegemony of the new world. And this opinion is widely shared. Newspapers carry headlines regarding the Monroe Doctrine nearly every day between Wilson's arrival and his departure again for Paris. Debates are held in the Senate, the House, and in public forums all over the country, and the League's most prominent opponents, men like Borah and Lodge, become household names having this very public debate. So opposition to the League really culminates when Lodge introduces the Senate resolution carrying 14 different reservations about the proposed institution, and the fifth one of those, the fifth reservation, precluded League jurisdiction over, quote, any questions which in the judgment of the United States depend upon or relate to its long-established policy, commonly known as the Monroe Doctrine. Said doctrine is to be interpreted by the United States alone and is hereby declared to be wholly outside the jurisdiction of said League of Nations. So again, carving out this space for the United States. And in fact, even defenders of the League, such as ex-President Taft, Senator Capper of Kansas, Senator Hitchcock of Nebraska, who's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They even invoke the Mexico question and US freedom of action in the country and their support for the League. So Hitchcock, in a speech to the Senate in February, says, "We have been told that if we join the League, we will place ourselves at the mercy of Mexico, which might despoil our citizens and commit outrages on our border and enjoy the benefits of the guarantee of the League as to its political independence and territorial integrity." But, he argues, this is impossible because the covenant clearly excludes from membership a country that could not, quote, give effective guarantees of its sincere intentions to observe its international obligations. And so in Poindexter's reading, Mexico can't possibly join the League, it's outside, and so it is not protected by the League, therefore the United States will continue to have its freedom of action. So Lodge introduces these reservations in the Senate, Wilson sails back to Paris, talks are already underway about these kind of reforms to the covenant, and the trip to the United States had really made clear to Wilson that US freedom of action in the Western Hemisphere would be a central issue if the Senate was going to approve this thing. And so the obvious need to have a kind of carve out for the Monroe Doctrine written into the League Covenant is there. So the opposition at home feels really confident about their intervention. Secretary of State Frank Polk cables the American delegation in Paris to say, "Senator Reid says that if critics have only brought about covenant amendment exempting Monroe Doctrine, time well spent." Right? So this is like the entire argument while Wilson is back in the United States. Hitchcock, the Democratic whip, also wrote to Wilson to suggest as such, providing a list of changes likely to influence Senate votes, which put a Monroe Doctrine reservation behind only a guarantee that each country would have absolute control over domestic matters. Taft goes even further, providing draft language for a Monroe Doctrine reservation. And so he cables to Wilson that the Monroe Doctrine alone will probably carry the treaty in the Senate. And so late in the evening of April 10th, after bargaining with Lord Cecil about the British naval power in order to ensure their backing of this, Wilson introduces the amendment to the covenant that ensures that the League will not affect the validity of, quote, regional understandings such as the Monroe Doctrine. And this famously becomes Article 21 of the League Covenant, but is not, of course, despite the assurances of these people back in Washington, enough to ensure ratification. So there's a long history of what happens in Mexico City after this happens, which I don't really have time to get into. But immediately, President Carranza recalls Pani from Paris. He sends him to Madrid. And he gives an interview to Robert F. Murray, who is the Mexico agent of Wilson's propaganda department, the Committee for Public Information. And this interview runs in the New York World and in papers around the country in syndication. And it declares that Mexico doesn't recognize the Monroe Doctrine and will never do so. So Carranza describes the Monroe Doctrine as an anachronistic imposition, and he takes Wilson directly to task. The doctrine, he argues, quotes, seeks to impose and does impose upon independent nations a protectorate which they do not ask for and do not require. He points out President Wilson expressed himself this sense in his address to Mexican editors, that speech that he had given the year before. Regarding the League of Nations, Carranza says, the Mexican government has not made, nor will it make, any effort to enter that international society, inasmuch as the bases upon which it's founded do not establish, as regards either its organization or operation, a perfect equality for all nations and races. And the Mexican government has proclaimed as fundamental principles of its international policy that all states of the globe should have the same rights and the same obligations. So, as mentioned yesterday in the discussion, this is sort of where the rubber of power versus legitimacy hits the road, right? As Carranza tells Murray, there is no Monroe Doctrine for strong nations, and there would be no necessity for such a doctrine for the benefit of weak ones if the principle of equality is actually adhered to. So Wilson has attempted to reconcile unilateral prerogative with multilateral legitimacy using this kind of ambiguous instrument of the Monroe Doctrine to carve out space to solve the Mexico question by force, if need be. But in the end, he fails. The regional exception wasn't strong enough to mollify the real material and ideological concerns of critics. So to conclude, I've argued here that scholarship on the world imagined at the Paris Peace Conference, first dominated by concerns over the shifting global balance of power between the US, Great Britain, and the USSR, and more recently imagining a Wilsonian moment elsewhere, has overlooked the surprising importance of the question of Mexico and the US relationship with Latin America more generally to the understanding of the United States' growing power. Not only was Latin America the first and most proximate arena of Wilson's foreign policy experience, the crucible in which US understandings of multilateralism were forged via the Pan-American Union, and this fight will continue there in the coming years, But perhaps most importantly, for Wilson's opponents, the Monroe Doctrine was actually constitutive of US power. It was the thing that kind of defined and made clear US power, and the threat they perceived to the League Covenant was therefore a mortal one. Mexico's challenge, and especially Carranza's denunciation of the Monroe Doctrine, struck at the heart of what the new imagined international order and its governing body as the League would mean for US power. And I think this tension between sovereignty and cooperation, embedded in a larger tension between hierarchy and the equality of states, was, as they say, present at the creation of this institution. The contradictions raised by the Mexico question were indeed and would continue to be the crucial questions for multilateral cooperation throughout the 20th century. Thanks.
Thank you for that really brilliant, rousing paper. It was great. Okay, I'll just open questions. Yeah.
Hi.
Why don't we'll collect a couple.
Sorry.
So Kevin, Ryan, and Steve.
So really quickly, thanks for the papers. They were really interesting. My question, I'm curious about the perspective of the Catalans and the Mexicans. Specifically, I think that when weaker nations are trying to stand up to stronger ones, I think what they need is kind of an ideology to glue them together, to make them powerful. And I think these ideologies are more effective when they're rooted in something that they can be proud of. And it might come from a national identity or myth or something, from their indigenous traditions or something. And so I was wondering, like, Christy, you were talking about how Connie was using liberal language, borrowing from the French, but I was wondering, is the Mexican idea of property rights based on some kind of ideology rooted in national identity or tradition instead of outer space, as some other people would say? And Georgy, you were talking about these groups who want either autonomy or independence, but did they have some kind of socio-philosophical values or ideology rooted in their own traditions or something like that?
Yeah, so I just have two questions. Dr. Thornton, I know that during this time, I believe Dominican Republic and Nicaragua are occupied by U.S. forces, and they send delegations to the Versailles Treaty. So I just thought, could you speak to more about how the rest of Latin America is factored into this debate? And I think the way you elucidate the Monroe Doctrine as the key kind of turn of rejecting League of Nations is really well done. I completely buy your argument, and I look forward to reading your book or any of your articles you produce. And then, Georgy, I would like to, so you talk about how the liberals and radicals are using Wilsonian language. Are there any conservatives or unionists in Catalonia using Wilson's language to refute the Catalonian nationalist arguments? And just if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, a question for Georgy. In your research, how do you interpret the difference of reactions between the Spanish side of historic Catalonia and the French side of historic Catalonia? When you travel in the French side today, you go to all those small villages, you see the same heartbreaking monuments to the dead, and they have the same family names of those on the other side of the Pyrenees. The fact that those Catalonians belong to one of the major powers, that make a difference in the political reactions of Catalans.
Is that okay? Great. Great, these are fantastic questions. So with regard to sort of where the ideology of Mexico's new property doctrine comes from, it comes from a near decade of revolutionary fighting in the country. And so the Mexican Revolution is a kind of disparate series of rebellions that get brought together under the rubric of overthrowing the dictator. And so there are many things that go into sort of Mexican nationalist ideology here. One of the most important is the question of how the previous dictator, Porfirio Diaz, had given particularly foreign companies concessions to the economic resources of the country. And so land for railroads, oil concessions, mining concessions, etc. That and the idea, so some of the uprisings that sort of lead to the revolutionary upheaval include things like the really important strikes at the Cananea mines in northern Mexico in 1906. These really begin to animate the ideology that especially comes from a kind of anarcho-syndicalist wing of the Mexican Revolution, the Flores Magón brothers, who founded a newspaper and actually end up in exile advocating for this from Leavenworth prison. But so there is a broad range of sort of ideological commitments within the revolution, but the thing that really underlies the Mexican property regime here is the idea that since independence, obviously in the colonial period, but since independence, which in Mexico comes in 1820, right, that the economic resources of Mexico have continually been given over to these foreign powers. And so if one of the kind of strong things about the Mexican revolutionary nationalism is that the economic resources of Mexico should belong to Mexicans. And so that means the subsoil rights, it means the land. So there are provisions in the Mexican Constitution basically that foreigners can no longer own land. And this persists for an extremely long time. It's still very difficult for foreigners to kind of buy a condo in Mexico City. You have to have a broker and a whole. So that idea is very much a reaction to the outward-looking development model, the kind of extractive and outward-looking development model that had been pursued, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. And it's something that the Mexicans share with other Latin American countries who have had similar experiences. But an important thing, and so this is kind of where the book that I'm writing starts, and then it goes all the way up through basically the neoliberal era, the debt crisis. But the Mexicans share these proclivities with many Latin American countries. There are some ways in which Mexico is just a kind of illustrative example of broader tendencies in Mexico, but because of the revolution, I mean in Latin America, but because of the revolution, over and over and over again, Mexican diplomats, economists, intellectuals, political figures argue that Mexico has a kind of special duty to be carrying these things out into the international sphere because it has gone through this revolution, revolutionized its laws, and so it has a kind of duty to project that outward. With regard to the rest of Latin America in the League of Nations, and sort of how other countries are approaching this and how it's thought about, there is a kind of vast debate throughout the kind of Western Hemisphere about how other countries should think about the League of Nations. And so other countries do join in the aftermath. They are part of the kind of wave of countries that come and go depending on the political proclivities of the particular governments. And I think the question of the kind of occupations of the Central American and Caribbean nations is a kind of crucial one. And that's one of the things that sort of led me to this, and that is in Manila's book, which is so generative because it's slim, there's so much more to be done, right? And so I actually had this conversation with Ares, and he was like, he agreed with me, so this is not a critique that I have not said to his face. But he makes this argument that particularly self-determination of African Americans in the United States is sort of the most glaring example of the kind of contradictions of Wilsonianism, right, of self-determination. And he ignores the fact that Wilson has Marines stationed around Latin America and all these places where the sort of existence of a US intervention makes very clear the kind of hypocrisy and that question. And so I think that's very much on the mind, not only of the countries that are actually being occupied at that time and before, which of course Mexico had Marine incursions in the years before, but the other countries in Latin America, they have, experienced the kind of long history of U.S. unilateral incursion on their own sovereign lands. And so to them, they can kind of see the contradictions in this Wilsonian idea about self-determination very clearly.
Mm-hmm. So I will try to answer my part of the question. First, thanks for the questions. So about the socio-philosophical basis, indigenous, about Catalonia. Yeah, well, first of all, this was formed in the 19th century. In the second half of the 19th century, all the identity of Catalan is built around culture. First of all, the language and the resurgence of the language, of the Catalan language, which in the beginning of the 19th century it was considered to be just a dialect of the Occitan. It took place at the same time when the Provençal was trying to re-emerge in the Jocs Florals, Game of Flowers, first appeared in Provence and then appeared in Catalonia, and that was just like one of the imitation taking. But in Provence, as I know, when I was there, I asked people whether somebody, do you speak Provençal? They said, my grandmother sometimes, it didn't take part, and that's what interests me. I will return to that moment about the differences between Catalan and this issue. That in Catalonia, well, as we know, the Catalan language is spoken, so language that have a literature, films, it's a live language, so not like in Provence, which is studied, but not very well, as I could understand, not so spread. So this was formed, and these were the basics for the claims for the autonomy, first of all, cultural autonomy, they also pretended, as Catalonia was the most important industrial part of Spain since the middle of the 19th century, they pretended to be the leader of Spain, and some of the Catalanist nationalists, one of them was the president of the First Republic, not very long, because there was a turmoil in Spain. There were, but the ideas of separatism, the language, was created by, during the end of the Great War, during the Peace Conference, because, and this is very well seen in the speeches, in the works of the nationalists, because before that, in the beginning of the 900s, Catalan nationalists demanded Catalonian empire, colonies, etc., because this was the sign of the good nation, the civilized nation. Colonies, empire, etc. And now, they got, after the Second World War, the modernity is small, nation states. That's the movement. So the language of self-identification, it was self-determination, excuse me. This is what this end of the First World War gave to the Catalanists. But the idea, the building of the identity separate from the Castilian, is that what they built during the intellectuals, somebody said that, we have to do that, but which emerged at the 19th century and what was based on a very old tradition of the Catalan or Occitan or Provençal language, which was common for this part of the Europe. As I can see, as I explained, it's not the only explanation, definitely. So conservatives that used the also Wilsonian language to begin these claims. Correct? I understand correctly the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, frankly speaking, yes, there were some, because they looked a little bit more carefully what were in the 14th points of Roosevelt, and there was nothing about everyone, all the nations, as we remember. And so they tried to point out that Spain is not the part of this. So all this language, all these statements, they are about everything. Well, maybe about the Austro-Hungarian Empire or about Russian Empire, former Russia, these former empires, but not about Spain, because Spain didn't take part in the war. There is nothing like that. So they were using this language to try to show that it's not applicable to the Spanish court. But conservatives at that moment in Spain, they didn't mainly they didn't use this language because it was not the most important issue for them. And the last question about the memory, correctly, about the war memorials.
There are a lot of French Catalans. Historic Catalonia is on both sides of the Pyrenees. But how do you explain the difference in the reactions of each side of the Pyrenees? Once again, the fallen on those World War I monuments, they're the same family names that you find on the other side of the Pyrenees.
The case is that in the 20s, they tried to use that myth about which I was talking about the Catalan villainities came from the Spanish Catalonia as the cause. But then during the 30s and 40s, after the Spanish Civil War, they had another cult, which is now also used as mythology about the Catalans fighting against Francoism, etc. So that's why nowadays it diminished. This idea of this Catalan volunteers. Although this myth was important for the Catalan separatists during the peace conference during the 20s, but in the 30s, it diminished because there wasn't a lot of people who really tried to do that. I mean, in the intellectual context. No, in the ideology of the nationalists, because I didn't study very well the monuments. This is not my sphere at this moment of study. So
it was just an image
Uh-huh.
to point out that there's two sides of Catalonia.
Yeah,
And on the French side, they reacted differently.
It is because of the differences of two states with different society, with different atmosphere. As for example, the same things appeared in almost the same region, like the re-emergence of Provençal language and Catalan language has totally different outcomes that we can see nowadays. So
Great. I'll just have one more question.
Yeah, just very quickly, and it actually builds on this. A question for both of you. I mean, at some level, the classic French story is that you have Provençal, right? You have Provençal, you have regionalism. You have regionalism in the United States in the last part of the 19th century. You have regionalism throughout Europe, and of course, the World War is what sort of catalyzes those and makes those regionalisms in some ways contribute to a more national story. I mean, in the case of the Filatov in the Provençal and et cetera, that's the classic story. And so at that point, the fact that Spain doesn't participate in the war is sort of, is kind of a key moment. And instead of having a war, you have a civil war in which the Castilian kind of world is imposed upon it. So that seems like a really interesting piece, and it's more of a comment than a question, but I just wonder what you think about that. And then I'm just fascinated by this idea placing Mexico almost back in the center of the debate. I mean, this is great. And I'm just drawn to the fact that the Monroe Doctrine is kind of hanging over a lot of other delegates' claims in the peace treaty, in the discussions. Japan, for example, that wants a kind of Monroe Doctrine for East Asia, and there are others that are sort of making this pretension. And I'm just going to toss this out there if you think this would be interesting. So first of all, it would be a historicization of the Monroe Doctrine, right? So it's not something that's stable. And the way it sits on top of this new American empire that's born at the end of the 19th century. And so at some level, I wonder if it would be interesting to think about, of course, we've talked a lot about the mandate system, we've talked a lot about empire, but what if you have sort of these sort of three ways of thinking about what we would generally call some sort of imperial power. One is a kind of traditional 19th century imperialism that's shaky but holding on. One is this new mandate system. And then this, I don't know what we call it, the Monroe Doctrine style imperialism that has to be reinvented or something. What's that?
Co-prosperities.
Co-prosperity, that's it. And at some level you have that one of the things that's at stake is sort of just trying to reinvent new modes of territorial influence and hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the logic of kind of spheres of influence is obviously operative at many different points. I think one thing that I would say in response to that I think is actually very generative and is a way that we tend not to think about this, is that one thing that does, if we put the kind of Monroe Doctrine question alongside the mandates question, alongside the formal imperialism question, one thing that allows for me is to center the contest involved, right? So we tend to think of US hegemony as being sort of maintained through a kind of legitimacy, a non-coercive legitimacy regime, and to which, if you read sort of mainstream US scholarship about this, in many cases, the Latin Americans appear over and over again in these multilateral fora to kind of rubber stamp US action. They're on board, and they are on board because of the kind of hegemony that the United States has exercised. And in fact, I think what that move would allow us to do is to see the question of the Monroe Doctrine as actually a question of intense contest within the Americas. And it is a thing that countries in Latin America are fighting with the United States about since its invention in 1823. And so if we begin to reimagine the Monroe Doctrine question as a question of contest, rather than a question of hegemony as a kind of maintained long-term, longue-durée hegemony of the United States, but in fact an idea about which there is contest in the Western Hemisphere for, I mean, it's been brought back by the Trump administration now, right? So for literally 200 years, then we can sort of put that contest alongside the same contest that we get in when we're talking about, Priya Satyas talk about the sort of responses to the mandate system, et cetera, right? So for me, it allows us to put contest back in the question of how power is constructed.
Great. So thank you so much for this wonderful